Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I see that we have some people kind of slowly filtering in. So I will give us just a few seconds to kind of get settled, and then we will get started. And hi, Ashley. I see that you were able to join us. I'm going to do an intro here at the beginning to get people oriented. So feel free to go camera off until then, and then you can pop back on once Jennifer comes on. Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to the first session of the Virtual National Adaptation Forum series, responding to climate amplified extreme weather events. My name is Carrie Schaefer, and I am the project coordinator for the National Adaptation Forum. Like I said, I'm going to give a brief introduction here in the beginning, and then we'll dive into our session. To begin, I would like to thank our sponsor, the CO2 Foundation, for supporting this series. The CO2 Foundation supports nonprofit organizations and individuals who seek to disrupt the causes and consequences of a rapidly changing climate. I encourage all of our attendees to visit their website and learn more about the great work that they are doing. For this session, as you all know, we are going to be using GoToWebinar. I wanted to take a moment to orient you all with the software. We will have plenty of time for question and answers during this session. If you do have a question, you can pop it into the question tab that you see on the side. In addition, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see 4 arrows kind of pointing inward that will allow you to expand your window into full screen. In addition, depending on the software that you're using, whether it's in a browser or downloaded onto your desktop, your setup may look something more like this, but the same type of capabilities. So you can see that full screen button there kind of near the top, and then the question tab down below. So I also wanted to note that this is just one session in a 4-part series that will take place throughout this month in May. All of these sessions are going to be recorded and posted to our website. The good news is that if you registered for this event, you are automatically registered for the next 3 sessions. So you don't need to go back and register again. And our next session is going to be 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, April 19th. Okay, and so now I am going to pass it off to our session moderator, Jennifer Lee. Jennifer is a staff attorney and an adjunct professor at the Harrison Institute for Public Law at Georgetown Law. Jennifer leads the Harrison Institute's work on climate adaptation, community development, and human rights. All right, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Carrie. It's great to be here, and thank you again for inviting us. Again, my name is Jennifer Lee, and Carrie has already summarized pretty comprehensively my day job. I am so thrilled to be joined today by the members of this panel who originally, I think, knocked everyone's socks off last October. Was it last October at the NAF conference in Baltimore when we were all squished into that little room that was filled to capacity. So our goal today is in part to have an encore to that presentation, as well as to expand on some of the issues that we were teasing out throughout the course of our discussion, and hopefully incorporating some of the very thoughtful questions that we received from the audience. So joining me today, just very briefly for introductions, are Aste Davis, who was the network manager for the National Black Environmental Justice Network, and also affiliated with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Joining us also is Dennis Chestnut, who is a civic ecologist and former executive director of Groundwork Anacostia River, DC, and one of the founding members of the Resilience Hub Community Coalition, also here in Washington, DC. And then finally, we are joined by Ashley Shelton, who is the founder and president of the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, also based in Louisiana. So in fact, Ashley is really the impetus for why we're all gathered here today. In September 2021, as you may know, Ashley published an article in Essence magazine that was titled "Stop Asking Us to Be Resilient" on Hurricane Ida, COVID-19, and trauma in Louisiana. And for those of you who haven't had the chance to read that article, I encourage everyone to read the article because I can't really do it justice in paraphrasing. And so the goal of the conversation today is to, hopefully also with members of this audience, is to unpack some of the themes that Ashley was introducing in the article, in which, Ashley, you talk about the importance of Black people in Louisiana, or the fact that they're made whole, and that they were not in fact made whole after Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Laura, and that this persistent need to be made resilient, and I say kind of resilient with quotes because that's the word of the day today, is something that comes up again and again and again. And as we've seen with the pandemic as well, that weight and that expectation of being resilient as an end goal disproportionately in this country on Black women, families with low wealth, individuals living in poverty, and rural communities. Ashley, you write that, and I quote, "I want to remind people that yes, Louisiana is full of beautiful, resourceful people. But folks cannot continue to expect us to be resilient. Resilience is a short-term condition where one stretches themselves until the problems can be resolved. The idea that resilience is a permanent state is a myth supported by white supremacy. Failing to address structural problems while labeling the people enduring such problems as resilient is gaslighting," end quote. So your call to action in that article is that communities must be centered in recovery efforts, and for us to invest in a climate change workforce, and for governments at all levels to respond differently by prioritizing communities who have been left behind in previous disasters. And so I really look forward to diving into that and what that means from a policy perspective, because as adaptation practitioners, we've centered resilience in our policy narratives, whether it's the promotion of resilience hubs, which Dennis also knows a lot about, or resilience as this pillar of public policy and legislation. To give a different example, I think we talked about an article in October that appeared at NPR last year that talked about resilience as a psychological term that describes a process of adapting positively in a context of significant adversity. And yet one might say that endless resilience, and we've also talked about this, is just another form of oppression. I think toxic resiliency is something I've also heard discussed. So I have an opening question for Ashley, and then I want to turn it over to Dennis and Astia as well. But to help get us started, Ashley, can you give us some context for the article that you wrote in Essence magazine that brings us here today? In many ways, the article does speak for itself, but for those in the audience who haven't had a chance to read it, can you describe for us some of the trends that you were seeing in Louisiana and around the country at the time that brought you to put pen to paper and publish the article, and maybe discuss a little bit some of the reactions that you've heard after you published the piece? And I will turn it over to you, Ashley.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think, I really wrote it from a place of pain, right? And just frustration around, like seeing yet again, kind of mass devastation in our state, so many people hurting, homes destroyed, and like this disconnect between when FEMA arrives, the power of mutual aid. And it's funny how it's like they want us to be resilient, but actually that's the only thing that works in disasters sometimes is that like community takes care of community. And so for me, it really was about like, we get these announcements of hundreds of millions of dollars coming into our state to make us whole on the other side of a storm. And what is more real is that no one knows where those dollars are. It doesn't make its way down to the community as quickly as it should, and then, or at all. And then also too, like the fight between, state and federal government to make sure that those dollars get pushed down. And also too, making sure that FEMA actually works for people. I mean, I think, we saw after Ida, where they basically sent up these, blanket denial letters, but not explaining to people what they were really saying is that I just need this one form from you, or I need this other form to complete your application. And so how are people supposed to, like, it doesn't make sense. And so for me, it really is about, we need these systems to be resilient. We don't need people to be resilient. We need these systems to work so that, again, when I think about FEMA, I think about these big numbers that get called out every time that there's a storm. Apparently it's like mutual aid works, disaster capitalism works, but like we're not actually figuring out how these resources are supposed to get to the folks that need it most. And so, and so the article really just came from this place of deep frustration and just feeling like how many more storms can our communities endure before our housing stock is just, it's just at a level of destruction that, we're going to be losing communities. And then, and then it also played out even more powerfully this year in Louisiana, because basically everyone's homeowners insurance has gone up by 40%. And in many cases, many of us lost our homeowners insurance and had to go find other care, like other providers. And, and our state's response to that was to give, Citizens Insurance $45 million. And that's $45 million that could have gone into, reinforcing roofs across the state with homes. Those dollars could have gone to weatherization for homes. There could have been any number of ways that we could have used those resources besides giving it to a corporation that's going to ensure the best, take the cream of the crop clients and then leave those most vulnerable without what they need. And so again, it's just one more example that even when there are opportunities to do the right thing in our state outside of FEMA, we still make the wrong choice. And so I would say after this was published, I think it was well received by, most folks around this idea that, that if you force people to live in a state of resilience for forever, it's just oppression, and we got to call it that, and we don't have to play around with the terms. And I think the other thing that's been interesting is that it has been bringing this question forward of that our disaster recovery system doesn't work at any level of government, and that, and that as we've seen more disasters hit more communities, there's this fear that now we're fighting for federal declarations for disasters, right? And so there's this ongoing conversation that I think we have to have about, my nightmare, which is that I have to fight to keep FEMA, as broken as it is, but that it may be the only way that, citizens are, have access to any way of being made whole. And so it's interesting times for sure. And I think continuing to be a very powerful conversation. Changes to the Stafford Act. There have been a lot of conversations recently about the grid and all of the things that just happened with the storm in Florida. I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of things that I think are happening that are opportunities for us to organize and support community and having some of these bigger conversations.
Thank you for that background introduction, which is super helpful. To help us kind of level set a little bit, because so much of this is, I hear you talk about mutual aid and communities on the ground. And so I want to turn it over to Dennis and Aste, and to get from you both, as well as you, Ashley, a better sense of the communities that you live and work in, because we also recognize that not all communities, not all communities can be talked about in the same way. They're not cookie cutter experiences, and so the solution sets cannot be cookie cutter as well. So what are some of the physical and social stressors in the communities that you work in, Dennis and Aste, that may impact the residents' ability to recover from disasters or just to normal steady state climate change impacts? And why don't we go to Dennis first, and then we'll go to Aste and then Ashley. What does resilient mean, or what does aspiring to a state of resilience mean in your communities?
Sure, and thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome to everyone who's tuned into this, and I hope we can provide you with at least some very valuable information to walk away with. So I'll say welcome to your capital city of your country, Washington, D.C., and also the last colony in the United States. And I say that to give some perspective to the other comments that I'm going to make, because part of the conversation is talking about government and government structure. And we have a little different structure here in Washington, D.C., in that We don't have the breakdown of state and county and city. We are all of those in one. Washington, D.C. is a federal district by law, so we're not a state, but we have all of the Congress people from all over the United States being the final decision maker on what the citizens of Washington, D.C., DC's elected officials who we've elected to represent us here in the city, and our lone non-voting delegate to Congress. So I just want to give that perspective. So because a lot of people around the country do not understand, they hear comments about the federal government in Washington D.C. and they forget that there's almost 1 million people who live here and are not represented in our government. So that being said, we have to work with the city government, in various ways. But we also, fortunately, because of the federal government's presence here, we have access to practically every agency that there is. And so with this discussion, I think that it is important to understand each of us and our perspective on quote unquote the government and our relationship with it and how it impacts, how we do the work that we do. And for the sake of this discussion, I will say, not to get hung up on the term, but I'll refer rather than to resilience. I'd like to refer to it in my discussion as community capacity building, because that's pretty much what I and my colleagues and the groups that we work with, pretty much that's what we're involved in here. Quite sure I'll get a chance to get into more detail about that in the discussions, but I can, and excuse me, and to how we are approaching that and some of the things we are doing to hopefully achieve some level of being able to respond to disruptors of whatever kind they are, and and also give you some perspective on some of the drivers of the area where we're focused on. So just in closing, the area of Washington D.C. where we focus most of our work right now and most of our attention is pretty much focused on flood risk management. And we are in this part of our city has these floodplains. 100-year floodplain is one that we have issues with making sure that we're prepared. This new pollen, excuse me, that our city is prepared to respond to these. And it just so happens that 85% approximately of the properties and residences that are located within this 100-year floodplain here in Washington, D.C., 85% of those properties are located in this area of the city, which is referred to as east of the river, but more specifically, far northeast, Ward 7. And it just so happens that this part of the city also is where the largest percentage of lower income residents and also people of color reside, live, and work. So, those are factors that weigh in to all of those points that I mentioned. And I'd be glad to discuss how we approach dealing with that as we go forward. So it's good to talk to everyone. I look forward to having further communication with you.
Dennis Oste.
Hi, everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, I am coming to you guys from Louisiana as well, and I'm lucky to go after Ashley because she lays down the groundwork a bit of, things and solutions in Louisiana before I even have to speak. So I'm glad to be after Ashley. But a little bit about myself is that I'm a native of Cancer Alley, which is the 85-mile stretch between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. I'm from a small town called Alson, Louisiana, which is also the home of 3 Superfund sites currently. And so this is something that I'm very passionate about. It's something that I've grown up around, and it's something that I think we really realized, as far as the word resilient is concerned, we realized in our last session that it's something that we have to handle with care. The way that we use it, we have to be gentle about it, because being from South Louisiana, you're going to get some of the best cuisine ever. You're going to meet some of the nicest people ever. But also, we suffer from a lot of extreme disaster trauma, and people are really, really sensitive around that word. So just from my hometown of Baton Rouge, just to set the social economic stage, Baton Rouge is over 50% African American, as well as having over a quarter of the city be below the poverty line. So it's a lot of working class folks who really, many of us, I feel like in this country, don't experience natural disasters as frequently as we do in southern Louisiana, and just the Gulf Coast, I guess, in general, when we talk about hurricanes and now tornadoes in Mississippi and things like that. But I think some of the solutions or ways of being resilient are some of the things that Ashley mentioned, like weatherization and having this funding upfront and being proactive instead of reactive. I think a lot of our issue, just as a whole, comes from not thinking about the fact that this season comes around every year, and we are constantly in the forefront of it. And I think something that is unique to Louisiana and a lot of other coastal places is the amount of industry that we have here. So you deal with the burden of thinking about, if you're, an environmentalist, at least, you deal with the burden of thinking about the fact that the place that you live is creating, a great majority of the emissions that are affecting our climate and making the disasters worse in the place that you live. And so I think the way that we speak around it has to be with care. We have to talk in a different way than other people about climate, especially when we're talking to Louisiana residents. It's not a secret that a lot of our citizens, would describe themselves as conservative. And so, sometimes when we speak with them, we have to use different terminology. It has to be around your personal experience. Like Ashley mentioned, my insurance has doubled. My homeowner's insurance has doubled, just because my insurance company left, and the quotes that I've gotten have been double what they were. So I think if you come at it with how this personally affects you versus for lack of better words, the people would say a tree hugger mentality, because that's what a lot of people would like to call people in the South who think about, anything as it comes to conservation or, climate and environmental issues. If you come into it with a more personal standpoint, that's kind of how we communicate those, that context to folks. But happy to be here. Passing it back over.
Thanks, Ashley. And I'm glad that you mentioned the piece about communication. That's definitely one of the questions I have queued up for you later on as well. Ashley, over to you. Can you help shed some light on the communities that you work with in Louisiana and also around the country on this matter of resilience and the climate justice work that you do?
Sure. So, so when Asti and Dennis spoke, it reminded me, I was like, oh, I never even said who I was, or like, what's my experience in all of this. But, I, worked for the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, which is now Foundation for Louisiana, which was created in the aftermath of Katrina, and went on to work on Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, the BP oil spill as well, but it happened on my birthday, and I was like, maybe I gotta stop working in a disaster paradigm, shift a little bit, because I think that like what you learn, you know, in that work, and now I do power building work in communities, and in that power building work, what we understand is that, you know, disasters are a part of our life, so much so that now it's starting to impact elections, right? Like we had, you know, Ida, we had to move elections after Ida because of, you know, it's, you know, like basically polling locations were destroyed, right? And so, you know, and so in the work that we're doing, you know, part of what I'm excited about is that, you know, at every level, both, you know, so at the federal level, you know, I have the opportunity to work with Organizing Resilience, and it's, you know, it's a collaborative of the folks that are on the front lines that are trying to figure out real-time solutions at the federal level. You know, there are folks that are talking about the fact that we need a whole rewrite of the Stafford Act, which governs FEMA and how these resources get spent. How are we getting disaster CDBGR money down to the, you know, how are we getting it to the ground and not kind of caught up in bureaucracy? And then also too, being innovative and thinking about ideas of like a disaster tax credit. What would it look like if after every disaster, people automatically received, you know, a 3-month disaster tax credit of $1,500, $2,000, so that we know these storms happen on, you know, payday. Every last one of them, whether it's the 15th or the 29th, like they're always somewhere around there. And so you've got people who have bills to pay. Louisiana is one of the second poorest state in the country. And so how are we making sure that people are okay in the midst of trying to evacuate and make tough decisions for their family? And then also too, you know, one of the, you know, like one of the other pieces that we've been looking at is fixing national flood insurance and looking at some of the ways in which we really have to start having some of these harder conversations. And then again, and if we are going to have to continue to depend on FEMA, that we have to fix FEMA. We have to make it, we have to figure out how to make it work. And some of that is some Stafford Act stuff, and then other parts of it is really in how they see themselves. And I know a lot of folks have been talking about this report they just released around equity, you know, from the FEMA lens, and how, you know, like I think it's one of those really hard things for me to kind of think about, like we can't even have a conversation about equity if we can't talk about the ways that FEMA is so inequitable. And I am glad that there's some level of awareness, but we've got so much more work to do. And one example I'll give you about too, speaking of equity, is that, you know, so think about, you know, after the floods in Tennessee, you know, OSOF was able to actually change the Stafford Act and allow FEMA to give folks, you know, reimbursements for how to show a proof of ownership without a clear title, right? And so when they made that distinction, that saved those communities. But that same thing did not happen for the Ninth Ward, and that's why the Ninth Ward never recovered. And so, and now also educating community about the new rule so that they can understand that you don't have to show clear title, you just have to show proof of residence, and that there are many ways that you can show that you own a home without having to try to get your 40 cousins and siblings and whomever else is now, you know, has right to grandmama's house or auntie's house or whatever that is. And so, you know, it's really proud to be continuing to fight at the, you know, the national level to try to, you know, solve problems in real time. And also too, thinking about, you know, like who are the decision makers around so much of what's happening in our communities. And so, you know, thinking about, you know, when I hear Dennis talk about the ways in which they've been doing work in his community, like how are we having those and incubating those conversations, you know, in Louisiana and in other places, and instead of like kind of passing the buck that it's somebody else's job to like help our communities rebuild, that actually it's the responsibility of all of us. And so, you know, when I think about, you know, disaster recovery, like that, we've got to have real conversations about the relief phase, the recovery phase, and then what's better on the other side of it. And also to really calling out disaster capitalists and just show like where this money actually is going, and how it's being diverted from our communities. Because again, if the only thing that works about disaster recovery is, you know, is disaster capitalism and mutual aid, we've got a problem, right? Like it's like some mutual aid, which is resources coming from community to help community, and then, you know, and then a whole bunch of folks that take advantage of it, it doesn't work. And also too, strengthening laws at the state level around contractor fraud and other issues that we know plague this process as well. And we just saw in Louisiana, and also in New Jersey that, HUD just, stopped all these clawbacks that were proposed for both of our states following Sandy, for New Jersey, Sandy and Ida, and for Louisiana, Katrina and Ida, and probably several other storms. And so, being able to say and do the advocacy that says that people did what they could given the circumstances, and so people shouldn't be penalized and trying to figure out how they're going to pay the government back 30 grand to raise their, to elevate their homes, and that, and that in so many cases it just wasn't possible. There was, again, rampant contractor fraud and other things that kept people from doing that. And so, so for us, it's really been an ongoing conversation and the ongoing work of, trying to talk about all of these other things, because I think before this conversation didn't include the grid, but I think that after what happened in Florida and certainly in Louisiana after the last storm, we were out of power for 2 weeks. And when you think about the impact of that on elderly people, people that are sick, that require, electricity to be able to live. And then certainly our babies who cannot sit in a home that, is 100 degrees because it's 103 outside, right? And endure that for, however long we're going to be without power. And then also to the excessive ways in which, energy companies take advantage of communities. And so again, talking about disaster capitalism. And so I do think that we've got some work to do, and I'm excited about the conversations that are emerging.
Thank you for reminding us of that as well, because I think one of the things that we should also clarify is that I don't think members of this panel are suggesting that resilience is taken out of the vocabulary, right? I think just behind the scenes, I've had a lot of discussions with each one of you about semantics and how we feel about it. And what seems to be the message I think we're trying to convey here is that resilience is often taken out of context by the people who are asking folks to be resilient. And it's becoming a buzzword that has become decontextualized from the primary goal, which is to support the communities. Now, on this question, I think Ashley raised several times of mutual aid versus government assistance. I know that's something that Dennis also feels very strongly about. Can we clarify the question of roles here? Because there's a lot of key players and chefs in the kitchen when it comes to climate hazards, whether in a disaster context or not. And so I think, Ashley, you've raised a lot of really interesting and great examples about your work, for example, with Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi in the disaster tax credit work that you're trying to do. Can each of you give a very specific example of what, in your view, should be the role of government when it comes to increasing the capacity of frontline communities to respond to these types of climate stressors, not just post-disaster or during times of disaster, but in recovery stages in the pre-disaster context? And I will start with Aste, go to Ashley, and then Dennis.
I think for me, one of the things that has really been top of mind is the way that we are spending infrastructure dollars that are coming down the pipeline from the federal government, and thinking about how we're prioritizing flood mapping as well as city planning before we prioritize these build outs. And are we surveying the communities that have had these issues, whether it be, like you said, disaster or non-disaster based, because you may, of course, you would say a hurricane or a tornado is a disaster, but in Houston or in Baton Rouge, an extreme flood can occur from, a couple hours of rain. And so are we surveying the communities before we approve these new build outs, these new highways, these new rail systems? I know I've heard from communities in Houston talking about how, they're building a new railway in Houston, and in more predominant, wealthy and white neighborhoods, those subsystems will be below ground. But when they get to the Black neighborhoods, they will be above ground. And so they're starting to fight these sorts of things as they get these infrastructure dollars, because we're all getting this money. And so I think that's my specific thing when we're talking about government. There should be, it should be agencies' roles to take these surveys, take these issues that have happened. FEMA is, collecting this data. What are we doing with it? Are we assuring that people in the same census tracts and the same zip codes are not experiencing the same effects or worsened effects because of these build outs? So I think that's my huge takeaway. And I think when we talk about resilience, thinking about the root of the word is basically rebounding, right? And so I think when we think about communities, calling communities resilient or asking them to rebound constantly, as Ashley said in her article, it just feels oppressive versus building them up on solid ground to where they won't have to rebound, installing things and making sure these infrastructure dollars are spent to make sure that drainage is right and that we aren't making, complete concrete, issues which, aren't permeable and causing more and more flooding. I think that's where we start. So.
And and I totally agree with what Asti has said, and I think Asti has said, and I think also I would add, around the infrastructure dollars. I think that all of the infrastructure dollars that are flowing in our states, and from the national level, we have to take advantage of that. And I think that it is an opportunity to actually center people, right? Like, I mean, I think we have to start considering what are the kind of programs that are going to help people, like help our state move forward. And so when we, like there's a bill being considered by our legislature around reinforcing the roofs of homes throughout, Louisiana. There are, pieces of legislation that are moving, to do any number of things to try to like refocus on how do we actually save our communities. And that, like that you want to talk about economic development. Well, you erode any possibility of economic development if the housing stock of our entire state, has been, destroyed by some level of disaster, whether it's flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, or whatever. And so I do think that, for me, we've got some opportunities with these infrastructure dollars to do people-centered focus, people-focused investments.
Yes, well, I think that I really empathize with the situation that my colleagues and the people who live in Louisiana and in some of those areas on the Gulf Coast, are experiencing. I guess we could even look at that in reference to how our other citizens in California, for example, are inundated with these fires on a consistent basis, on and on. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is we finally gotten, at least to one extent, a recognition that climate change is real, and we're still trying to make sure that we raise the environmental literacy of the residents so that they understand that. And there's various ways that we're approaching it here in DC. I'll say, listening to what the challenges that you're having in Louisiana, I think I described our political structure, our governmental structure here in Washington, D.C., that is separate from the federal government. I really want to emphasize that. But to one extent, because we don't have a breakdown of having to go through a state, county, and then city or municipal level government in order to move certain things forward. At the local level, that really works well for us because it's kind of like a one-stop shop. So, as a result, and because of our long relationship here with the federal government, I mean, we have a very long relationship with the federal government, all the way back to when, and this is part of my lived experience, when we had no elected representatives in Washington, D.C. to represent the citizens here. Of course, that changed to some extent in the late 60s, around 1968, when we got something called home rule. And the first mayor that we had was an appointed mayor, but eventually we were able to get that same person elected into mayor. We formed our government, city council, so forth. But that one-stop shop, I think, has helped us out a lot. And Washington, D.C. has been used as a model in a lot of ways for initiatives and things that are planned to roll out, to the rest of the country, at various times and various phases. That was even the case, for example, with emancipation. The residents of Washington, D.C. were emancipated a year before the actual document was signed for the rest of the country. Not that that made us special or anything, but we were the test case or the canary in the mine to a certain extent. Those freed slaves at that time. So because of that rollout of initiatives and things, we have been able to maneuver, work, and weave our way through the system to really get some very progressive things done here in Washington, D.C. That has, especially along the lines of climate change and the impacts on the communities that's most affected by it. Now, there's still challenges they're going to be, and we're working through ways of addressing those. But fortunately, through our local elected administrations, we have been able to have some continuity on certain things like a sustainability initiative that has built in things that include things like building codes and requirements for permitting that really forces buildings and builders to apply some green building codes, so to speak, using that terminology, to their construction. I mean, they would build it regardless, however the client wants it built. But when you have these components built into that part of the system, it makes a difference as to the outcome. So we have stormwater management built in. We have even some very innovative programs that actually subsidize certain things for residents to do on their properties to help reduce flood risk, stormwater risk, and things of that nature. So, I take I really work with the group that I'm immediately working with right now. If we want to use that term, it is actually called a Resilience Hub Community Coalition. So, of course, we're working to inform. I don't like to use the word educate all of the time, but we're working to inform our community about what that actually means. And this I won't go into because I know that there's a later session that talks specifically about resilience hubs. But that is what we're building out in this community that I described as one of the frontline communities with some immediate impact as it relates to some of these climate change issues. So we have to work with these folks. We don't have a choice. And I look at whether it's the federal government or our municipal government, I take the posture that they work for me because it's my money, and I try to get this across to our residents and our community that it's their money that these folks are working with. So take that posture in reference to how you approach and deal with them. We can't go approach them, so to speak, with like hat in hand. We have to actually make sure that our voice is heard loudly and clearly as co-equals at least, but that's our money they're working with, and we have to demand that our money is spent where we feel that it best should be spent. So that's my perspective on that.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And I have just one more question before I'm going to turn it over to audience, and I appreciate the questions that have already been coming in through the chat, and I will try to kind of tee them up for you in some of my next questions. And that is, I think the next question is really kind of going back to Ashley, something that you had already mentioned, which is this idea of risk communication. Thinking, as we do about the role of government based on what you've all said, and Ashley, I think you were mentioning something as narrow specific as clearing title and how helpful that can be and the kind of the domino effect it can have. A lot of this has to do with providing data and providing and communicating effectively with community members. And I wanted to kind of ask this question around risk communication is, given the level of distrust or trust deficit with members of frontline communities and government at whichever level, or sometimes even with non-government entities and stakeholders, how do you communicate climate and environmental risks or the options available for action by community members if they want to be, I think Dennis's word the other day that he used in private conversation was self-reliant, to the best that folks can be self-reliant. How do you communicate effectively with frontline community members, including those who experience chronic environmental hazards or repetitive disasters, to which just may sound like a broken record?
So,
Whether from your capacity as nonprofit entities or community advocates, or what you see happen in government conversations.
Right. So I work with a lot of communities. The NBEJN, the National Black Environmental Justice Network, is a coalition of environmental justice organizations as well as advocates. And so from my experience, a lot of times organizations in a community don't start as environmental justice organizations. A lot of times they are just communities that have come together. They see something wrong. They see changes. They see, different things that are concerning to them, and they come together. They may have come together for some other reason, but they, realize that environmental issues is a big concern of theirs, and so they pick that up. And so, as I mentioned, we have to, if you want to establish trust between community and government, community, and even, an NGO, you have to trust them too. You have to trust that these people have generations, especially, I would say for the South and, other places as well, but particularly in Louisiana, a lot of the places where the communities that I deal with are situated are in proximity to the plantations that they were freed from, the areas in which they were forced to live post-slavery, and with indigenous communities, the areas that they were forced to as well, due to colonialism. And so I think, trusting that they've been there for hundreds of years, some of them, and for our ancestors, for the community that I'm from, I have passed recently. I did a Cancer Alley tour, and I passed this church literally every Sunday, y'all, and I never stopped to think about the fact that the sign at this church says established in 1900. And so when you think about the fact that this community has had this church and has been around this, church since 1900, how long these people have been here. And so who is the real expert of how this place, this, landscape, this area is, if not people who have been situated there since 1900? How many generations, of people are there? So I think we start with understanding and accepting community experts as they are, right? As who they are, and stop belittling the knowledge that they have, and also empowering them to take some of that into their own hands. We have communities that have done this science, that we have trained through different, programs and institutes on how to use air quality monitors, how to, they assess the way that their community, the water is flowing, all these things. And then, the government will say, this isn't reliable information, and throw it out and accept the information from, an industry or a governmental agency that the community then doesn't trust. And then they come in and say, oh, here's the solution that we came up with, instead of asking them what they want, asking them what they need, relying on the things that they, are putting forward as solutions. So I think it starts there. It starts with trust. And sometimes to establish that trust in, like I said, in areas of Louisiana that may be more conservative, may not view themselves as environmentalists, may not want to hear the word climate change or global warming, then, like I said earlier, I start with, wow, have you been getting a lot more rain lately? Or, wow, it's April and in a couple of days it'll be cold again. That is so odd for this time. And so I think you start to get people's personal understanding there too. And just, I think a lot of the government's issue is coming in and extracting information from communities and not bringing it back to them, or not allowing them to use it for their own good either. So the government will come in and ask, these communities, oh, have you been experiencing flood events? Let me run this 30-minute survey to you. And then when I get all this information that I know you and your neighbors all said the same, you'll never see those results. Or institutions will do the same thing. They feel like, you get my story, I run my trauma to you, I open myself up, and then you don't allow me to use that information for myself when I'm advocating for myself. And so I think that's a huge part of the barrier of trust that exists. And it's something that, organizations have to really, really think about before they enter communities, organizations, agencies, anyone that is not a part of that community. You have to think about what you are going to give back to that community. What is your mission? Is it just to do research? And if it is, you have to be upfront and honest and allow them the opportunity to decide if they want to participate, to decide if they want to share their stories with you. Because, like we talked about, this is a triggering issue. This is something that people don't realize that, some people have lost everything and rebuilt it. And I don't want to talk to you about losing everything and rebuilding it if you won't help me sustain it now.
So what I'm hearing is meet people where they're at and defer to lived experience expertise, because they know probably a lot more generationally than people with clipboards and survey charts and mapping data. Not that those aren't also, but also framing expectations and making clear to the community what your role is, and not over-promising or under-delivering. And you're asking people for their stories, and this is something I hear a lot, but what do the community get in return for re-traumatizing themselves as they share with you their stories? Ashley or Dennis, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, again, I can share, just some of the ways that we're approaching some of the things that we're doing here. For example, just last night, we kicked off a training program. This is our second, it's a series, a community emergency response team training. And it was really jam-packed. We had 24 community members who registered and started participating, was at this first kickoff session. And it runs, for a couple of months, with the culmination of these citizens being trained in, emergency response things, everything from first aid to recovery and so forth and so on. It's very, very good program. It is, some of the money comes from FEMA, but we also to pay for it because the folks that deliver these kinds of things, that's one of the things that we've made sure of here locally in our community, is that all of these kinds of services by people that are delivered, and when I say by people, there have to be instructors there. They come with certain other kinds of equipment. Well, make sure that that they're not just volunteering. So they have to be paid. So we've worked out ways of actually taking care of making sure that gets done. And we've even gone a step further. We've have funding available that we've acquired funding that we are giving stipends to the residents who participate, but they're not getting that stipend until after they complete it. But we have a few $100s that each one of those residents will receive once they complete this community emergency response training. We've done that even with forming this Resilience Hub community committee that led to this coalition that we've built, by even providing things such as daycare for people to be able to come, when they come out to meetings after working all day, that there's daycare included if they have a child that they need to pick up from school, come and be able to come to that meeting and be there for a couple of hours. We even provide dinner, and then we also include stipends as well. But see, what this does is this puts value on the community's time, and because of being able to put that value on the community, like you said, community centered. We've been able to keep people connected and in the process really build, because now we've actually empowered, and I like to use that term, we've empowered residents over this period of time that we've been working through this process, who are now empowered to go and work in their own communities to help expand and build this quote unquote resilience that we know we need in reference to these disruptors that we expect to face and deal with. So I was glad to hear, made me think of something when Ashley mentioned that church she went by and saw the date on it. My father was 1 year old when in that year. He was born in 1899, and one of the things that I can fortunately attest to is that I've been a bridge between my community, which, I live in the same house that I grew up in. And I've been in this community, for a long time, for almost 75 years. And so I can be considered what you might call a trusted messenger, or I have a level of credibility with the community. And because of that, it has developed a level of credibility with my ability to work through and within the government agencies. Because, like it or not, they are tools for us to use to achieve the things that we need to achieve going forward. And as I said, here in Washington, D.C., we've learned a long time ago how much we can and can't depend on the federal government because of the kind of relationship that we've had with the federal government over time. But we've worked through it, and we've moved forward in some tremendous ways, and we'll continue to do that. And hopefully we can be a model, not just for the residents of the different communities here in Washington, D.C., but maybe what we're putting together can serve as a model for other communities in some of these other locations that can serve to help move them forward in this way as well.
Thank you, Dennis. Ashley, I'm going to turn to you with a different spin on that question. For communities that don't have Dennis Chestnuts, who can kind of be that intermediary, one of the questions in the chat is...
Every community has a Dennis Chestnut. You just have to find them. They're there. Okay, that's just a point I want to make.
Thank you, Dennis. Hopefully this is not too much of a leading question, especially with Dennis's response. So acknowledging that there may be Dennis Chestnuts in every community, or there will be Dennis Chestnuts in every community, can you be a little bit more specific about who should be organizing people to address these concerns? And that's specifically one of the questions from the audience. And I'm reading this just out loud. Often these issues are handled by different levels of government, local, county, state, and federal. For example, the state of Louisiana is paying insurance companies to ensure residents don't lose insurance, and that's a state issue. Houston's train route construction practices are a county municipal issue. FEMA working with residents to ensure their application processes and notification letters is a federal level issue. What advice do you have for us as attendees as to how we should organize ourselves and efficiently allocate our time to address the issues raised, especially across different levels of government that operate in a very siloed capacity?
Yeah, no, I think it can look a lot of different ways. I think to Dennis's point, I mean, there are trusted community leaders, right? I mean, we partner with churches, we partner at every level of government, right? Like I work with for example, with FEMA, right? Like they have a office of neighborhood. Let's see, I don't want to mess it up. Basically, faith-based and neighborhood partnerships is the name of the office. And, and I work with them a lot to be able to increase community engagement. And so for them to also explain like what is happening. Also too, like Power Coalition, the organization that I run, we do a lot of fact sheets, right? Like we push information out. I share as much as I can. But I think for the folks that are here listening, I think that, we can't be afraid to talk to people. And I do think it's all of our responsibilities in the sense that, it's not hard to go to the city council and go to the chair and say, like, we need to have a conversation with community about and shape a conversation. And like I've found that, with New Orleans, the city council has been, more than happy to work with me, and even state government. And I will tell you what's interesting is that I have beat state government up, and they keep coming back. And they, and again, it depends on the personality, right? Like not everybody's been as receptive to community being able to ask hard questions and say, this is, yeah, because I think it's also too, even connecting back to Dennis's, kind of point around, there's a piece of this that is about self-reliance, but there's also a piece of this where we are all accountable for rebuilding, our state and our communities. And that requires communication, that it requires us to work together. It requires us to hold government accountable. And here's the thing that's hard is that, it'd be one thing if this was just, a little sprinkling of money, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I'm fine with being self-reliant, but again, somebody's getting this money and it's not people. And there has to be some accountability. And I think that where that accountability shows up is, like, again, we brought together state officials and asked the hard questions. We brought together work with city council members to have community briefings and answer hard questions. And so I think at every level of government, there are definitely partners that, we can reach out to and folks that we can engage with, to enter and, like to really think about like, how are we engaging community? Because here's what we also know is that whether it's that church that's, 1900 years, like it was created in the 1900s or whatever, like at the end of the day, community really does know best. They know what they need. They know what the solutions look like. They know who they trust. And so, again, when we are trying to solve problems around, kind of long-term recovery, right? Working with the Office of Community Development at the state, working with all of these different levers, but they're all levers. And I get to that. I also saw in the question too, that it's like, yeah, like, and that takes a whole lot of time, but there are community partners like Power Coalition, and other organizations, certainly, there are some Dennis's and some Power Coalitions and, Deep South Environmental, like there are a lot of groups, right, like that are willing to have these conversations, provide guidance and support, and also willing to help convene community. Power Coalition is a convener. I will convene community to talk about anything. If you got a real, to Asti's point, if you are doing something that is going to have a positive impact and you're willing to work with community and all that means, right? It's not like you show up, you get what you need and you leave, but you actually are building a relationship with community. Community will respond every single time. Once you build trust, there's an opportunity to really like open up a treasure box of like what's possible in community. And so I do think that, we have to see government as a partner, and we have to also find the pieces of this puzzle that work, right? Like, so I can't talk to everybody at FEMA, but I can absolutely talk to, this office of faith-based and neighborhood partnerships to get stuff done and move up within the, they have their equity officers here for IDA. And so being able to actually talk to them about how Native American communities were excluded literally from from being included in the maps to be able to receive funds, right? And how outrageous that is, right? And our local government did that. It wasn't just, it wasn't just like FEMA made that decision. Our local government actually made that decision, and that's unfortunate. Local and state government made those decisions, but I do think that it had but FEMA never called a question, and we didn't know in enough time to call a question. But it is something that we are now working on and fixing, because that's certainly not fair or equitable for any community that's been destroyed or devastated by a hurricane and not have access to the funds that they need. And so again, I think that there are levers, and like you just have to find the people that are willing to do the work, right? Like, and willing to be the community voice. And there are a lot of different ways that looks. And so sometimes it's a church, sometimes it's a community, a power building or movement building organization like Power Coalition. And then there's certainly lots of climate organizations, well, I always say climate justice. I know in Louisiana it's very much so environmental justice and climate change. And so I was like, no, it's climate justice. And we're going to talk about those things together. But these organizations are out there, and these communities are ready to talk and share their wisdom. And there's so much wisdom. And that's actually where the self-reliance comes from, right? Like, there's this big thing about how communities are taking care of each other. And it also, too, is an example of how the mutual aid, again, it works more than many things are working, right, when we look at disaster recovery. And so I would just say, look for the levers, look for the relationships and the trusted community leaders that can help you get the insight that you need to make, the best planning decisions, inform, whatever level of government you're working at. All of those things, I think, are opportunities and and the responsibility of all of us to try to make sure that we're bringing community together and into the conversation.
And also look for the generous trust of the community as well. Aste, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I wanted to add to Dennis's point about understanding that government works for us, and I think a part of that I've been really intrigued with lately is understanding that if any of us can run for a government office, any of us can work in a government office, but that doesn't mean that I am an expert on every single thing to do with the area that I'm representing, the state that I'm representing, the agency that I work for. I may not be an expert. And so I think organizations like the Power Coalition putting out fact sheets or saying these numbers out loud or making these assertions makes our government officials say, "Oh, is that true? Someone else published that information. Let me go and look that up." And it also offers us the opportunity to invite them to our table. A lot of times as community, we think about being invited to the table, but sometimes you need to come to the learning table. Sometimes you need to see these numbers and see that this research exists and understand how to use it and understand how it affects communities. And I think that that is an opportunity as well to organize. Like if you have some sort, I'm sure some of the people on this call may be in academia or, working at organizations like ours. If you are not engaging your leadership, whether it be local, federal, state, with this context, because you cannot, assume that they know everything about everything. You cannot assume that they're staffers, even if they have a person on staff that is around the environment, they may have one. And and that person is expected to know everything about everything. Sometimes we have to send that information to them as well. So I think that that's a small level of organizing that people don't talk about, but that's a small level of getting them on board as well. Of course they can deny it, but a lot of times if we have credible information, it's hard to deny. And I think it's, something that has been on the top of my mind a lot lately. Like, how do I engage them to, bring forward this information that they just may not know, they may not be privy to?
That's actually a really good tie-in to one of the other questions that appeared in the chat, which is, this question is, how useful are the climate-related components of state and local FEMA disaster preparedness plans? This author wrote the first one for Washington, D.C., and had very little reliable data to draw on to make informed projections. To your point, Aste, about the value of information sharing. So how can state and local scientists be helpful in providing data and analysis?
I think it depends on, who you're leaning into. And like I said, that community information as well. I think state and local sciences can be helpful by getting that information to maybe communities. Maybe that's something that if you know that a community is organizing around a particular issue, using the community that I'm from, for instance, in 2016 there was a flood in Baton Rouge, and all of the debris from that flood was sent to this community where I'm from into the landfill there. And so I don't think that maybe community members understand, the methane that comes off of, they understand the smell, they understand the change, they know that it's bad, but maybe they need the information from some of these other, scientists around the actual effects of, these issues, or showing them, guiding them to the information where maybe it lives, because everybody knows, I don't know about you guys' state sites, but Louisiana state sites are not user friendly. They're not easy to navigate in finding that information. And a lot of times when you see these disaster plans or these preparedness plans, they aren't made with community in mind. And then that's what causes them to fail. If, a community is expected, let's say they're evacuation plan is primarily by car, but you have not surveyed how many people in that community actually have a car. You know, Louisiana, unlike a DC, unlike an LA, does not rely heavily on public transportation. It's something that we've, you know, been pushing for, but it's not something that they can rely on. So, or like Ashley said, our storms are coming on the 15th and the 30th. A lot of people are choosing between rent and evacuating. So if we don't have evacuation plans, or we don't have these disaster preparedness plans in place that are informed by community, then they are null and void. They don't, you know, they don't work well, and people are still being trapped. People are, you know, and then you get the media or the out of state response. Well, why didn't they leave? Well, if you don't have a car, or you don't have money to leave, or you don't have a place to go, or you have to work. A lot of our, you know, we talked about essential workers during COVID. What about essential workers during disasters? That's a whole nother thing. But, you know, if you have to work, if you have to stay, then where's your plan taking that into account? So, you know, that's the way that I think that they can lean in.
Yeah, let's put a pin on leading, because that's a good question. But to you, Ashley, what are ways that plans can be more responsive to community needs and priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's so many ways they can be more responsive. I mean, I think we saw with the plan in Lake Charles after Hurricane Laura. You know, like they made a plan, and today people are still living in trailers that they're paying the government $1,000 a month, you know, to live in, until they can figure out what they're going to do with their home and their housing, and fighting their insurance company. And that is egregious, right? Like there's something about that that's so wrong. And it's just like, and then also we never talk about why the plan failed. You know, like where the disconnects were. And, you know, Lake Charles is a different community. Like it has its own, you know, unique personality within Louisiana, more so than probably, other than the Delta, it's the only other place that has like this very different kind of business community, you know, personality that actually works for them, right? Like, you know, business and community doesn't work together in Baton Rouge, unfortunately, and not very well in New Orleans either, but it does work in Lake Charles. And so trying to help, you know, like I think that data becomes really important when we start thinking about, you know, like how are we having real conversations in real time, and being honest about what works and what doesn't work. And when they fail, I always say, like, you didn't talk to community. I don't even need to understand what went wrong. I already know what went wrong. And so those are definitely big opportunities. And I also, you know, saw that, you know, in the questions that someone mentioned, like, you know, at what point do we consider relocation and some of these other things? And I think that that's where data is also, and science is important. I think that, you know, like it's one thing for you to tell me I need to relocate. And I think that also we have to talk about this more broadly, in the sense that, like, I mean, over 80% of the citizens of this country live in a disaster-prone community. So, I mean, at some point, like, where are any of us going to go if you're susceptible to fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, flooding? And knock on wood, hopefully there's nothing else we're adding to that list. But, you know, if 80% of the you know, the citizens in this country are, you know, I mean, like literally we're talking about, you know, we just had the 10-year anniversary for Sandy in New Jersey, and I'm working with New Jersey right now to look at federal fixes, you know, for disaster recovery. And so, like, I mean, so if we're talking about New Jersey, New York, and Baton Rouge, and, you know, Lake Charles and New Orleans, then there's a bigger question about, you know, like what questions are we asking as scientists, right? Like, what are the questions? And so there are some places where it really is, okay, people need to move. But the reality is that there's some places where folks can't go, you know, like there's just nowhere for folks to go. Also too, in places like Louisiana, land is everything. Like land ownership is a thing. So much so that we still have Napoleonic Code as the law of the land in the state of Louisiana, which is, you know, different from every other state in the country. And with that being true, you know, even though we have law that supports land ownership and the landowner, we have to have bigger conversations about, you know, like, okay, the answer is that there's this part of the community that has to relocate, where are they relocating to? also to giving people real value for their homes, right, or their property. And I think that, people want to, we've seen it. There's been at least one or two successful relocations in Louisiana, but we still got work to do, right? Like I think that, the valuation of those properties are still much lower than they should be. And I think that that's also the piece of this that has to be talked about, is like what are people going to be given for their land? And then also too, the fear that people have about losing land and moving away from land that could then, it's like the thing of like, I leave my land and then you build my land up and then build whatever it is that you wanted to build, right? And so it's like, so if it's possible to build it up for economic development, then there are some places in our state that you need to look at building up communities, building up that land, because it is the right thing to make community whole, right? Or building levees or doing those things that we know, protect communities. But I do think that, we have to stop, like I think sometimes we get trapped in thinking there's only one answer or one way to think about this. And the reality is that all of us are living in disaster prone communities. And, and sometimes the answer is not going to be to relocate folks, because where are they going to go? I mean, Baton Rouge, for example, we have over 400,000 people living in Baton Rouge since Katrina. And that's actually more like 430,000 folks. And, and it's like, there's nowhere else to go in Baton Rouge, right? Like they have developed almost our entire community. And now we're starting to see that displacement, of communities. And so I do think that when we think about data, like data has to work both ways, right? Like it can tell the truth, well, it should always tell the truth, right, of what's happening, but that it also has the power to ask different questions so that we get to answers that force different outcomes, right? Like, so the answer is yes, like folks could relocate, but also what is the question about what would it actually take to lift this land, or to, like what kinds of other adaptations could be made to help people stay where they are. Or, again, the Corps of Engineers in Louisiana did, everybody elevated their houses, right? And in some places, people in South Louisiana feel very strongly about that wasn't the right thing to do. And then other places, folks are just like, as long as the government's going to help me do that, I mean, because that's a big expense, I will consider it. And so I just think that it's important to think about data from a, three-dimensional perspective. That, I think that they're the basic questions, but then I think that there's some other questions that we have to ask based on the realities of the place, because Louisiana is one of the poorest states in the country. So some of these questions are harder because, I just mentioned homeowners and moving land, but what happens to the renters? What policies are we putting in place to make sure that renters have some agency, right, in the aftermath of a disaster, and they're not sleeping in their cars, or because the property manager said we're going to take this as an opportunity to rebuild and then raise the rents once this new facility is updated or whatever. So I'll leave it there, but I do think that we have to look at data in lots of ways. Like we talk about leadership all the time, and I tease folks because we always want to think about the word leadership in a positive way, right? Like leadership's great, but I always remind people that there is also leadership that holds the status quo or that stops progress. And so, so there's good leadership and there's bad leadership. And I think that's also true about, like how we use data. Like, for me, it's like, how are we using data to prove what's happening to people so that we can actually get to a real response on what the solution can be, right? And you can't do that if you're only asking the question from a place that doesn't actually understand where people are and what's already happened to them.
Right, and I think, and I don't want to kind of pivot back to Dennis, but really quickly, just because we've kind of went into the relocation retreat conversation, I think, Aste, the example you gave of the church from 1900 is oftentimes the people who you're asking to relocate or move they never asked to be there in the first place, right? I think this is something that we've talked about in past conversations. But from kind of a more lessons learned or best practices context, I don't know, Ashley or Aste, Ashley, particularly in your work for Foundation for Louisiana, the question from the audience is, do you have an example of communities that have considered planned relocation and how intermediaries are able to facilitate those conversations? And I think you have probably a few examples in mind.
Yeah, now there's, so there was absolutely several communities that were relocated. And I think that, we have a planning organization, Center for Planning Excellence, that came in and helped be the liaison between government and community to try to help make that as powerful as possible. Also, Southern Mutual Health Association also facilitated, the communities like ERATH and others that had to like literally move out of a flood, like a literal flood bank. And so in that process, though, they made sure that the land was valued, was valued in a way that, people weren't losing or felt like they were losing anything by relocating. And so, and so I want to say, like, I remember ERATH, and there were a bunch of little communities right there by ERATH that all in kind of the heart of, Lafayette, New Iberia area, like those communities actually did do a successful, resettlement of people. But it was hard. And I think, again, we can't shy away from the hard things, because I don't think, you're talking about taking somebody's land that their grandfather or their great grandfather gave to them, and then saying, like, you're supposed to move to this new place because it's safer. And I think that we cannot underestimate the power of sentimentality and the power of, like this has been in my family for 4 generations, right? Like there is such a powerful thing that people connect to when you start talking about resettlement or moving them. But I do think that people also understand that they can't also keep bleaching their house on an annual basis after every storm, cleaning out debris, doing all of these different things. And so people are, willing to be reasonable and have these conversations. But I do think that it's important that there's a liaison that's working between, the state or the, municipal government that's trying to do this, as well as that community, and also to making sure that there are fair valuations on these properties, because we do know that, and we're still fighting this in New Orleans to this day, that like, homes and, in Black and, Black communities, regardless of class, have lower valuations than their white peers and counterparts. And so we also have to look at our implicit bias when we're trying to also give people fair valuations for their homes. And right now we're working to, so gentrification is happening so rapidly in New Orleans that, we've had to fight, we've had to actually do a slow, what's the word I'm looking for? Like we've actually had to work with the city to basically do a slow process of rolling out additional fees, right? For folks, like, so if your neighborhood was just a regular neighborhood before, like let's say Treme, it's one of the oldest neighborhoods, the oldest Black neighborhoods in the world, in the country, and now it is very gentrified, and so it raises the property values and then the property taxes. And so we've been working with the assessors to say, whoa, like we got to do this a little more slowly, because people, like who could have planned for their whole neighborhood to be gentrified, right? And so I think it's happening both in the very specific way of like communities being relocated, but I think it's also happening when you look at, how gentrification is also pushing people out of communities. And so what are the policies that we're willing to put in place to say like, whoa, like we need to be able to prioritize the integrity of this community at the same time that we, receive, people can move and live wherever they want to, right? But it's like also we shouldn't push out the people that have lived there for generations as well.
Thank you for that, Ashley. I'm getting a reminder from Carrie that we need to close out in about 5 minutes, and I have 2 more questions to squeeze in there for the 3 of you. So I will try to speak as quickly as possible and ask for brief answers if possible. Dennis, I'm going to turn back to you and see if you have anything to add to the question before our question about retreat in terms of how scientific information can be used or leveraged to help community members, because I know that you've done a lot of work with local government on the climate planning and have, had to seat at a table in many of those discussions.
Sure, and I'll keep it brief. And just in reference to one of the earlier statements that I made, I like to use the term community champion. And rather than, there's a community champion in every community that it's up to those of us who do that work to identify and engage those community champions. They might not even have any knowledge of environment or anything along those lines, but they are the people within those communities that when things happen or when folks need to find out something, those are the people that they go to. So yes, there's somebody in every community that's a community champion that can be tapped into, and then we have to figure out those ways of pulling them in and empowering them to help empower their local communities. as far as science, science is one of those things that is absolutely essential because everything that we're dealing with is science. One of the things that we've done here with this process that we're working through is we, for the last basically 2 years, we have a presentation series that takes place every week by a different entity. And the one that I've been presenting on, started off with just showing the difference between weather and climate and getting people understanding that so that they can understand what they need to do to go forward. So that's, my response to, using data. Data is very important, and we have to get it and make sure it's palatable for the community to be able to digest it. You're muted, Jennifer.
Thanks. Thank you for that answer. So there's 2 more questions, more substantive that just came up in the chat. And Ashley, I'm wondering if you're able to respond directly in the chat. There was a question about reforms to the Stafford Act. But I think the last question I would like to pose for all 3 of you is a question around semantics and kind of circling back to where we started, which is what terms better capture how we should be framing our work other than the use of the word resilience? And that's a question from an audience member. So I will go to Aste and Dennis, and then maybe Ashley, as she also works to answer the Stafford Act question.
I think Dennis used the word empowering earlier. I think empowering our communities to rebuild or solidifying the ground that they're on. I think that is a better term than resilience. I think that's the way that I would shape it. The government is giving us tools to reclaim what's already ours. So if they, acted in a more proactive than reactive way, it would just be solidifying, adding another, board onto your treehouse, right? To make sure that it's solid and won't, go anywhere. So I think that that's a good way to, some of the solutions that were proposed today to talk about it.
Well, I'll say, and of course, empowering, but I'll go back to what I described initially, and that is building capacity, because that's what the activity that we're involved in here is building community capacity to be able to respond, but also, and one term I don't like to use as much as resilience, and that's recovery. Because recovery is, of course, we understand it, but something that, as they said earlier, is basically rebounding. So I would say building community capacity and rebounding from whatever disruptor it is, whether it's climate related or otherwise. I mean, we even face, like potential, disruptors that could completely turn over everything that we presently know in reference to how things are. And especially right here in Washington, D.C., where we get the focus of a lot of things that we don't necessarily ask for, but they come here anyway. So
yeah.
that's disruptors, yes.
I work a lot on resilience hubs. So are you suggesting that it should now be called building capacity hubs? And that is a rhetorical question that we can answer in series 3.
We would have to, we've educated for a year and a half. We'd have to go back and waste time, trying to do that. No, let them be resilience hubs. They're starting to grab hold to resilience hubs, and maybe later on we'll turn them into something else.
Ashley, can you close us out?
Yeah, no, I think that, I think that, unfortunately, like in Louisiana, resilience certainly has, folks are like, anybody that says it, I mean, it's the comparable to thoughts and prayers. Like, I think we need action, right? I think that, like, what people are asking for is change and action that, that actually leads to real solutions. And, to Dennis's point, I think the resilience hubs are a great example of action, right, that can be taken to make communities, better. And also, I think that there's room to reclaim resilience, reclaim the word. But I do think that for me, it's about action. There's no other way to say it, that we have to be about taking action and centering people. And I think that, like, we think that that is community's job, but I think it's all of our jobs to make sure that we're centering the voices of people that have been impacted by these storms, and that unless we're doing that, then we're not doing it right. And and I would also say too, around the Stafford Act and other pieces of this, like the example of how they allow people to not have to show a clear title, but to show other ways of, showing several months of an electricity bill, or, of other ways of folks to be able to show that they have, true residence. Like that was a great, huge win for us. I mean, it's, about 15 years too late for New Orleans, but important nonetheless as we continue to go through these storms. And then I think that we're also too thinking about a couple of things about like what we could fix, right? I think the Stafford Act also determines how FEMA dollars can be spent overall, and what goes back to the government, what stays in a community. For example, when you look at money that was given to New Orleans to fix its parks, or to fix facilities, part of what's been hard is that they have all these rules that they go by that make it hard for us to actually recover those properties. And so I do think that we've got to start thinking about the way the money flows and loosening that up. And then also too, maybe thinking about doing more work with other departments, because again, like I can make CDBG-DR dollars work because it's sent through HUD. And so how are we thinking about and doing that work of of thinking about recovery, from the perspective of the Stafford Act, like flood insurance also run by FEMA not working. Like where else can we send, like how can we use HUD to use, to fix these problems? So thinking about too, like not only do we need to amend the Stafford Act, but also too, how do we bring in agencies within federal government that actually work? And so I do think that at the end of the day, we've got a lot of opportunity, a lot of work to do. And I think that as disaster becomes more prominent and impacting so many more communities than just South Louisiana or Louisiana in general, that we've got more work to do to make sure that the federal government makes a long-term commitment to disaster recovery, which also requires the Stafford Act, to be changed. Because again, unless the federal disaster is called, and we've had, several communities had to beg the president to do a call for one of the tornadoes that just happened in Mississippi. Like we have to then solidify, like, what does it mean for you to get federal help in a disaster, whether somebody considers it big enough or not. And so I do think that that's also a really important piece of this work that we have to do. And there's a lot of restriction in how the Stafford Act uses disaster dollars. And so we've got to do some work to really fine tune the Stafford Act to allow these dollars to come to our city, to our state and our cities, to be able to do good things. Now, with that being said, we also have to have work to do with our cities and our state to make sure that they're also being equitable and how those dollars then flow down to community. There is there's a great report that just came out from Organizing Resilience that's, that literally is named But Next Time, because it's about the fact that at some point we're going to get this right. And there are a lot of recommendations and federal fixes in that document, and you can find them on our website at powercoalition.org. But I really appreciate being here today.
All right, well, I can go ahead and jump in. I'm very sad to have to end this session. This was absolutely amazing. I feel like I could sit here for the entire afternoon and listen to you all speak. I'm going to go ahead and pull up this slide one last time, but I really want to thank our panelists, Ashley, Aste, and Dennis for being here. Thank you, Jennifer, for excellent moderation of this discussion. This was incredibly informative. And for our attendees, thank you for taking the time to come out today. I wanted to remind you all that, again, this is a 4-part series, so we will have 3 more sessions as a part of this series. In 2 weeks, we will be having a session on housing recovery, And please keep an eye out as well for a post-series survey that is going to be sent out after the very last session, which will be held on May 17th. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.